My next guest is the Director of Executive Recruiting at Google, where she leads the non-tech recruiting team. Her areas of expertise include diversity and internal mobility. She's also the author of a book called Career Mapping, which is all about empowering workers so they can take charge of their professional journey. Ginny, it's great to see you. And how do people take control of their destiny in this turbulent, crazy world where technology's hitting, COVID's hitting? You know, and I sort of feel, and I'll come in with the shtick I started with earlier today, I sometimes feel like we don't give workers all of the kind of skills and toolkit that they need to navigate it, but maybe I'm wrong. So tell us a little bit about what you think they can do in this time.
Yeah, and it's interesting. See, thank you for having me, by the way. And I apologize, I'm having some connectivity issues here, so thanks for bearing with me. What do people need? One of the things I spend a lot of time talking to people about, this is inside and outside of Google. People want to know, what can I do to get a job or get to the next level? And to me, it's beyond just a degree. It's beyond just the skills. They also need some coaching, and they need to be able to understand and articulate what their real competencies are. And those are gained any variety of ways. And I work mostly at the leadership level. And so that's a lot of what we talk about. It's how are you going to transfer and pivot take some of the capabilities and competencies that you've developed and possibly.
And now I think we've got Ginny Clarke back with us, right? There we go. Ginny, it's great to be with you. Thank you for coming back, because I really, so, you know, in terms of this, we were just getting to the juicy parts about giving people, you know, mapping, you know, giving people an understanding of how to navigate this terrain. But let me just be blunt. High-tech sector, broadly. I mean, we did a program the other day where I had Franz Cordova, the former chairman of the director of the National Science Foundation, and Susan Hockfield, the former president of MIT, and Ellen Stofan, the former chief scientist at NASA. We had amazing women in science, and each one of them said, there are not enough. There are not enough in technology. We're not doing enough. And so I want to just ask you, you know, in your position, as you were talking about a leadership role, what can we do to get gender equity, and I hate the word equity, you know, just normality, you know, in this area, and why can't we do it tomorrow or today?
Wow, it's a big question to sort of unpack.
You know.
No, it's okay. It's something that I've spent 20 plus years devoting my life to inside executive search firms and inside of Google. And, you know, there's a whole infrastructure. There are ways that we assess for talent. And there are people, and people have biases, and people have beliefs, right? So I'm not even, the supply issue, I think, is less of an issue. We still, obviously, as it relates to women in technology, underrepresented individuals, we need to do a better job of getting people certain specific kinds of education that are going to set them up for some of these more technical roles. But this, at the same time, what I spend so much time doing is trying to get people, our hiring managers, to assess on the basis of competency and the things that really matter, especially when it starts coming to leadership, right? So you can't just keep saying, well, I'm going to hire this person because they went to this school, they have this degree, they have this many patents, and so they must be good. And yes, I know them, therefore I know they're good. That's really not hiring world-class talent. And so we have to get good at assessing what good really is and letting go of some old rubrics and protocols that we've used to exclude a whole group of people who can arguably take us to places we've not been before.
Look, the most moving real-life example that I have experienced with someone who's changed the game for real people, I mentioned earlier in today's show, is Jim Mckelvey. And Jim happens to be the co-founder of Square, so he's doing just fine. But he created LaunchCode, and LaunchCode was designed to take, you know, largely, you know, individuals of color, you know, those that were elderly, but people were kind of pushing them under the rug and pushing them out of the, you know, talent line, or, you know, people that had health issues or had been previously incarcerated, and training them to be world-class coders. So they were trained world-class coders, but not getting jobs because the HR department said, oh, that person's too risky, it's not there. And so Jim began, you know, knocking down the doors of the CEO of Cisco and the CEO probably of Google and other places to say, you know, your HR department is not going with the flow here and is neglecting real talent on the table. I was very moved by this example, and I'm wondering if there's any way that boutique example is something we need to scale.
Absolutely, it is what we need to scale, because as you're describing, there are people who have the skills, and now we need to create an organization that is willing to embrace them. And arguably, so many of these companies have had cultures that, by the very definition, are very exclusive. There's a certain way that you have to, forget about the pedigree for a moment, but a certain way that you have to look. That's been loosened up considerably, especially in tech. But there's a way that you're expected to behave and to talk. And so there's not as much room for difference as we would like to believe. And that's some of what we need to address, in addition to what is the perceived skill gap in this whole conversation.
Ginny, in a company like Google, and I don't know how personally you want to get this, are you looked at as a person whose mission most want to embrace, or are you looked at as a nuisance that's trying to force them to go in a direction they don't want? And I ask this because in my experience in Silicon Valley, Y Combinator has been out there trying to do this. I know some people in the VC community that have been trying to invest in, like, particularly black entrepreneurs, Hispanic, but they remain at the fringe. And I'm just always interested in, you don't have to answer this, but I meet folks at Citigroup who were engaged in environmental issues 15 years ago, and I said, look, are you real or fig leaf? And it's an interesting question for this part of the world about when does it become something that's in the bones and the muscles as opposed to something that you're just wearing lightly.
Yeah. Oh, God, that's such a beautiful question, Steve. And it's one that I continue to ask myself because, as I said, I've been doing this for a really long time. I do want to believe in my heart that because of George Floyd's sacrifice for us and so many other Black folks who've been killed in this country. But I do think Black Lives Matter has created more of a burning platform than we've seen before. I want to believe that. The proof will be in the pudding. I'm certainly pushing harder and trying to help people connect the dots. And so, for example, I've said directly to my team, now, if you acknowledge Black Lives Matter, then it would argue, you could say, it follows, it's logic, that the very Black and other underrepresented individuals you have inside your organizations today have also been, more than likely, myself included, oppressed along their career journey. So we have been underleveled, undervalued, undercompensated, and often underestimated. And so let's not continue to perpetuate that inside in treating the way the people that are already inside the organization. And let's start looking outside and looking differently. I'm not saying lower standards, not at all, not for a minute, but I'm saying maintain the standards and start looking in a different way using different criteria that actually are linked to one's success in an organization.
That's a beautiful answer to a question that I know is a curveball, and I appreciate your candor. And just, I guess, finally, Ginny, I'm just sort of interested in the time we're in when you're thinking about education, and anyone that looks at it says, there is a big, I don't know what they call it, jobs gap, skills gap, but there's talent being left on the table. And whether or not we need to disrupt education in the way that we find more nimble credentialing, more nimble ways for educational pathways, more large enterprises like Google or large enterprises like AT&T, for instance, created a nano degree for any person off the street. They would come give them basic competencies, and so those organizations of scale can create norms and habits that others might copy. And I'm interested in what you think that scaffolding should look like.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's big, because I think the scaffolding, I think I'm going to go back to what I think is foundational in that infrastructure that I alluded to. When you break it all down, Steve, this comes back to hearts and minds. This comes back to leaders who believe in the human condition and the goodness of the human condition and people's abilities to learn and have amazing skills that heretofore might not have been acknowledged and valued. So, that I'm not trying to dodge your question, but I think so much of this is about leadership. And that's what I spend a lot of time talking about I have a podcast where I talk about it, and really picking apart what are the capabilities and competencies that leaders need to be exhibiting. And one of those things is building inclusive teams, because that's what's going to make them the most successful. And that means that they must know how to motivate and inspire people who don't necessarily look like them or come from the same background.
Well, Ginny Clarke, you were the punctuation point I wanted to end the day on, and so I'm glad we got you back. Ginny Clarke, Director and Executive Recruiting at Google. I hope you'll come back, because this is such an important topic, and I know you've been at it a long time, and I would love to, we should call it Uncomfortable Conversations, because we need to do things along that. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Steve. I really appreciate your patience with me.